Hello, and thanks for joining us today for our webinar from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Hallie Leinhart, and I'll be your host today. Our webinar will explore the topic of the student loan crisis, policy burden, and borrower well-being. The total amount owed in federal student loans has more than quadrupled between 2000 and 2020, up from 387 billion to around 1.8 trillion. This soaring student loan debt and the increasing cost of higher education in the United States requires critical conversations and research into its societal impacts. Today's webinar will examine the complexities of this crisis from several different angles. To discuss these perspectives and topics, we are very pleased to welcome three distinguished panelists. First, we'll hear from Dr. Fenaba Otto. She's an associate professor of public policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She'll present her research, which examines how the student loan crisis disproportionately affects Black borrowers and how this impacts inequality in the U.S. Fenaba, thanks for joining us today. Next, we'll turn to Daniel Collier, assistant professor of higher and adult education at the University of Memphis. He will share his research, which explores the experiences of borrowers in income-driven repayment, IDR, and public service loan forgiveness, PSLF programs. Daniel, it's great to have you with us today as well. And finally, we'll hear from Dominique Baker, Dr. Dominique Baker, Associate Professor of Education Policy at the University of Delaware. She will present her work on how education policy affects and shapes the access and success of minoritized students, primarily focusing on her recent work looking at administrative burden in applying for financial aid. Dominique, we're so glad you could join us today as well. Please note that the views expressed by our speakers don't necessarily represent the opinions or policies of the Institute for Research on Poverty or any other sponsor, including UW-Madison. We have an hour today, and after we hear from each of our presenters, we'll spend the last 15 minutes or so at the end for a live Q&A. You can type those in the Q&A box. We did get quite a few questions submitted as people registered, so we will be queuing up some of those as well. I hope you'll also feel free to participate through the chat. We'd love to know who you are and where you are joining us from. And I also wanted to let you know that we have closed captions enabled, so you can toggle those on and off of your screen, at the bottom of your screen. We will be posting the recording of the webinar within a day or so, and you'll receive a link to those by email. In addition, we have gathered a few relevant IRP resources on the topic of student loan debt, and I'll be dropping those into the chat and including links to those resources in my follow-up email that you'll receive within a couple of days. So with that, I'm very excited to turn it over to Fenaba.
Okay, can you see my slides okay?
They look great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hallie. Thank you, Institute for Research on Poverty. Thank you, Sarah, for this invitation this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to get started because time is limited. So racial disparities in student loan debt are quite massive. So when leaving college, Black students hold about 85% more debt than whites. 10 years after leaving college, Black young adults hold approximately 170% more than white students. And from our calculations, we see that Black young adults owe more 10 years after college than the average white student did when they left college. We also know that Black college graduates are more than 5 times more likely to default on their loans in the decade following graduation, and that these stark racial disparities in student loan debt accumulation and repayment make it clear that race and racial inequality are central to understanding the student loan debt crisis in the United States. Any discussion of student debt that fails to consider race is missing a crucial piece of this puzzle. So this, where I started and what I've started explaining is an argument that's raised in the introduction of my book, which is co-authored with Jason Houle, who's a professor of sociology at Dartmouth College. He's also a very longtime friend. And the book is a culmination of work that we explored separately and together for over 10 years. So student debt has traditionally been thought of as good debt, right? The kind of debt that leads to a college degree and a lifetime of social and economic benefits. Um, and the purpose of our book, or the driving question, was whether all this debt is paying off. And to understand this, we knew that we had to turn to what was happening after college when young adults leave school, join the labor force, and begin trying to repay their debts. So over the spring, summer, and fall of 2019, we interviewed nearly 50 Black student loan borrowers, all of whom attended four-year colleges and universities. And we weave their stories together with over a decade of largely quantitative academic research on the causes and consequences of student loan debt. Chapter 2, which we entitled Off to College, Into the Red, begins with the acceptance to college and focuses on how students and their families kind of navigate this transition and fund their first year. We ask how longstanding racial inequalities in parental wealth, education, and income kind of exacerbate the Black students' need to borrow for college and can tend to also foster into complicating this transition. In some of our earliest work, we show that family wealth is a particularly important resource that drives racial disparities in student loan debt. We ask whether parental wealth was associated with lower debt loads for young adult college goers. And not surprisingly, we see, what you might expect, this negative relationship, right? Students from wealthier families left school with very little debt when compared to those from less wealthy households. However, when we disaggregate this by race, we see that the relationship holds among white students, white young adults, but wealth had almost no relationship, right, on student debt accumulation among our Black young adults. Not only are Black young adults more likely to come from families with less wealth, but they also accumulate more debt on average. We believe this work is important because it highlights the fact that Black families are less able to use their wealth or their economic status to protect their children from accumulating a student debt burden. And it's also suggestive, as I will get to in a little bit, that these patterns of racial wealth inequality are being replicated by student debt accumulation. Many of the people we talked to credited their extended family, aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, with providing them with a financial boost when they got to college. So here, Daniel acknowledges that his aunt helped him pay for unforeseen expenses when his parents could not help. He says, Mom and Dad were just always there, he said, but my aunt committed to what she called the aunt scholarship. She paid for my books every semester as long as I kept my GPA at a certain level. That was out of the kindness of her heart, which was a super duper big help. And for Agnes, she had all people helping her, parents, aunts, uncles, siblings, and grandparents. Freshman year, everybody helped in terms of extra money that I needed. I was still broke, but if I needed something, I could ask. So this informal financial support from extended family is common among Black families, right? But it also can exacerbate racial wealth disparities, excuse me. Receiving help from extended family members is a necessary strategy for paying for college, but it comes at a cost, right? Financial transfers tend to deplete grandparents, aunts, and uncles of their own financial resources, and diminishing their wealth. And for Daniel, Agnes, and others, this means that the money that they counted on in their first year may not be available for them as they progress for the subsequent years of their college career. We also know that Black parents have also been disproportionately burdened by the growth in the Parent Plus loan program. Unlike federal undergraduate loans, there are no loan limits on PLUS loans, which means that parents can go deeper into debt than their children. Here, Alexandria has a similar story from when she was in college. She says, during my college career, I took out like $20,000. And then the loans that my parents took out, I don't know the exact number, but I think it was closer to maybe 80 or 90,000. So we see Black families are in this vicious intergenerational cycle, right? Because Financial aid underestimates their financial need and fails to consider their lack of wealth. They go deeper into debt to send their children to college, which further diminishes their wealth. In Chapter 5, we consider the consequences of student debt for economic, psychological, and social well-being, and show that student loan debt has made the transition to adulthood more fragile and precarious for Black youth. One of the themes we kind of explore are feelings of self-blame and regret. Many we spoke with internalized their debt as a personal failure. It's like, on one hand, I should have done more education for myself, but then I feel like, no, they kind of make you feel like it's okay. So that financial literacy part is missing. But I kind of feel like I've been manipulated a bit. This is Naomi, she's 26 and a graduate. And then Jared, who accumulated approximately $30,000 in debt in college, said he had no choice but to borrow, but thought that others were less responsible. So these respondents, as I said, have internalized this personal responsibility narrative while distancing themselves from those who they saw as irresponsible. What this leads to is a potential collective action problem for debtors, right? So how can we organize politically when we believe that you've been cheated, but that others who share your position got into those positions making poor choices? But more in the short term, we also realize that it makes people feel isolated and very miserable. We also know that anxiety, depression, dread, fear, worry were also common themes among our respondents. And these debts loomed very large in their minds. Lisa said her student debt is like a cloud over my head, following her around as she goes about her day. It just feels like I'm never going to be able to pay it off. That's kind of depressing sometimes. And Virgil said he couldn't stop thinking about his debt. Every time they send me an email, I get a little nervous seeing the email pop up across my phone because I feel like I never know what they want, or I know that they could be asking me for more money. Definitely stresses me out all the time. So it seems obvious that student debt creates psychological turmoil. But actually, we see that research on the mental health consequences of student debt has been a little mixed, right? Some scholars find evidence that student debt is related to psychological distress. Others find that those that have debt have different or even better mental health than those without debt. And some have argued that this is because student debt is not nearly as stressful or distressing as some believe. However, I think all the people that we talk to would probably disagree with that assessment. And in our book, we offer a different explanation. We argue that the racialization of student debt leads to more destructive consequences, right? Psychological and more for these Black borrowers. We also explore how debt delays milestones such as postponing or putting off marriage or forming long-term relationships, having children, acquiring homes. We also explore the phenomenon of the boomerang phenomenon, excuse me, where after leaving college, students they left their parental home and then they returned either due to financial stressors or to receive additional parental financial support. We also look at how our respondents may have altered their career choices and their decisions due to the debt that they are carrying, foregoing their passions for more practical reasons, or feeling rather tethered to their current roles by choice. I mean, not by choice, but by necessity. In Chapter 6, we focus specifically on the racial wealth gap and argue that while higher education is often thought as this engine of upward mobility, excuse me, and a ticket to the middle class, it has made what we often view as the fragile Black middle class even more fragile. So many borrowers knew that the opportunity cost associated with debt repayments was high. Here, Yasmin, she's a 32-year-old community college and four-year college graduate, says, I mean, I would have had more disposable income if I didn't have the debt. My net worth would be plus 17,000 right now if I didn't have the debt. So I mean, in the abstract sense, it has impacted it. And every month, every dollar that I put toward the debt is less money that I can save or invest in something else. And she's right. All else equal, we know that by age 30, having student debt is associated with lower net worth, financial asset accumulation compared to those without debt. And if Black borrowers are paying down their debts while their white counterparts are purchasing homes and saving for retirement, then it's very small probability that they will be able to catch up or surpass them. And those who are falling behind on their loans, who are defaulting or delinquent, their ability to save for the future and accumulate wealth is further hampered. So in this way, the racialized student loan debt disparities that emerge in young adulthood can exacerbate racial wealth inequality. Our respondent stories also highlight the economic burden of student debt for short and long-term financial security. We know that these stories kind of reflect both wealth disparities that persist across generations, but also are displaying how they increase within this generation. So we use data from the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, their 1997 cohort, and estimated the racial wealth gap among college attending young adults. And we see that a disparity are from around 22,000 at age 25 to more than 56,000 by age 30. So Black college goers are kind of stuck in place with as far as their wealth holdings are concerned, between that approximate 5-year period, while white wealth more than doubles. We also find that racial disparities in student debt accounted for around 13% of the racial wealth gap at age 25. We also find, as you see at the bottom of this slide, that the contribution of student debt to the racial wealth gap increased over time. So just to kind of summarize what I've already said, many Black families, oops, many Black families use social capital, turning to extended family and community for financial support. But these college costs can be a burden on the extended family, which can diminish their wealth further and in trying to help their children fund their college education, often as a personal sacrifice. I also shared that we know that student debt is associated with psychological, relational, and economic strains, including stress, self-blame, delayed milestones, and constrained career choices. And I want to end with this call to action that we as scholars and this policy network must consistently hold higher education and be critical of higher education and examine it for its role in perpetuating racial and economic inequalities. I want to underscore that student debt is not just an individual burden, but a societal mechanism that is reinforcing and recreating inequality. I believe it's important to empower borrowers by shifting this narrative from blame to larger systemic critiques and encourage a shift towards greater support to reduce financial burdens through policies and ensure equitable access to higher education at the same time. Thank you for your time. I will now pass it off to Dan.
Hello, everyone. Just looking to share real quickly. All right, we'll jump right into what I'll be talking about today. Normally, I would talk a little bit about myself, but the time is very limited here. Just a few things I want you to know. I grew up in working class Chicago, the Chicago suburbs that are. We literally lived next to a farm, and the grocery store was all the way over there and stuff like that. So I was kicked out of community college the first go around. I returned to community college, went and got a PhD. People laughed at me when I said I'm going back to do this because who gets kicked out of community college to go do that? I came to Kalamazoo to work at Western Michigan, then Upjohn, and now I'm a professor at Memphis, where my tenure case is being considered, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be a good thing for me. So what are we talking about today? We're going to be talking about student loan debt. We're going to be talking specifically about income-driven repayment, who happens to be on these programs. We're going to talk about public service loan forgiveness with a focus on well-being and outcomes. And we're going to talk a little bit about some early research findings that I have from my recent survey. So the first question is, okay, there we go. Too many buttons to push. The first question is who happens to be on income-driven repayment plans? And this might change given new income-driven repayment plans exist now and people have to flip in and out and who would be or would not be going to school and new parameters. But for now, we know that people with higher balances, ever since Repay had been introduced, people those with $40,000 or more in federal loan balances are more likely to be in it. Having a master's degree, which also correlates to having a higher balance. Also, those individuals would be more likely to be in these programs. But a few things that we don't really talk about much in how we generate these policies are that women are more likely to be enrolled, which makes sense. They are more likely to earn less than men on average. Also, middle earners. So those making $50,000 to $70,000 a year are more likely than those making lower wages to be in these programs. Again, that correlates with having a master's degree. These are about master's degrees earnings. That's not too far off from median earnings. So we would expect these individuals to be here. And then, of course, non-white borrowers. And these data these are from data using the Survey of Consumer Finances, which I'm going to be honest, is an imperfect way to figure out who are in these programs, but it's one of the few indicators where people get to report being in these programs. So, one thing that I've found is very beneficial into talking with policymakers about are these other factors that exist, because some people are very interested in this topic, even if we haven't made movement in the wider policies to change it for the people that might happen to be in it. So when we think about people who would be in income-driven repayment versus traditional repayment, again, same data set. They are less likely to have a savings account if you're in income-driven repayment. They're less likely to. There will be less money by a couple $1,000s, so they can't save quite as well. Again, less likely to have retirement accounts, less money in said retirement accounts, lower FICO scores, more overall debt, which makes sense. If you have a lower FICO score, you're going to be paying more for things over the course of time. And then a really nasty thing called negative amortization, where people are repaying in the ways that we would expect them to repay. The government says pay $150 a month. Actually, the average is about $293 a month. And they do, but that's not enough it's not enough to bring down their balances. So next month, your balance is higher. Everything grows. And that not only engages in a lot of psychological distress, which I'll talk about later, but it also makes things more expensive and it shuts off opportunities for credit. Now, I want to shout out Brad Hirschbein, who taught me about the wonders of Sankey graphics, and I see he was in here. So, Brad, thank you for that. So the first wave of data that I recently captured on public service loan forgiveness specifically focused on subjective well-being. It was in collaboration with Protect Borrowers, which used to be the Student Borrower Protection Center. And what I found with people in public service loan forgiveness was the average FICO score was pretty good, which we would expect because they had higher wages on average, but they also had high debts. And I collected these data while certain policy parameters existed to ignore certain debts on balance sheets. It's during COVID, so we have to keep that framed, right? Homeownership's a little bit down, but subjective well-being. So it's the idea. Subjective well-being is like, how do I feel mentally? Am I satisfied with life as well? Things like that. Nothing really happened with subjective well-being until coming close to forgiveness. Everyone had pretty much the same kind of mental distress here, as you can see off to the side. This is a chart of mental distress by little to no, mild to moderate, and severe distress. And the line thickness represents how many people think about suicide. So it's yes, no, and these are the yeses. And as you can see, it's pretty standard in the middle range, but then you get 5 years out and there's elevated distress, and that usually is correlated to being early in your career, trying to figure things out, which younger workers, we would expect to see some elevated distressors here. But there's something that we found that was really, really interesting in that people waiting on a forgiveness decision. So you have your 120 payments, you think you made it, and then you turn it into your servicers and the government, and they make a determination on whether you get forgiveness or not. These people have been waiting anywhere from a few months to over a year for that decision. And in that time, uncertainty exists, right? And with that, more people started thinking about self-harm. And we'll get back to self-harm a little bit later because it's a lot different now than it previously was. But then we go back to forgiveness and that self-harm subsides. The good thing is, even though we have elevated suicidal ideation in these within this survey, very, very few people reported thinking about developing plans or even engaging in the in actually harming themselves. So there's a lot of distress, more so than action towards suicide here. And that's something that we need to focus on. And I for the last 2 years, I've been talking about the people on waiting for forgiveness because that's a focus that we really need to assist people with. And it's still bad to this day, which I will say. So the last individual talked about how sometimes student loan debt relates to dissatisfaction with life or mental distress, mental health, and sometimes it does not. Well, what I found in my work is that student loan debt factors, be balances and remaining payments for those in income-driven repayment, are part of a larger construct of financial distress. So there's good debt like housing and car debt is okay, depending on how much car debt you have. But generally, these are like good, durable things that you get something for. You can even walk away from through bankruptcy, which is not ideal, but good, right? And then there's not so good debt like medical debt and credit card debt and whatnot. And that all goes into this general construct of financial distress with student loan debt. And that is the gatekeeper that we think towards subjective well-being, which also goes to suicidal ideation. Tay out in Purdue created a nice conceptual model that I used in my work, pretty much looked at it and said that financial distress is maybe that gateway. So that could be one reason why we're finding uneven results, at least in the past with student loan debt and financial distress and psychological distress. Now, let's talk about some new data. I've been collecting data from the start of 2025, and I'm still collecting it right now. And things are not quite as the same as they previously were. So on this survey, we're actually teasing out self-harm from suicidal thoughts in a different way. In the previous survey, we masked it a little bit because we didn't want everybody knowing that was our focus. Now we're just straight up asking people, what does this look like for you? And about 19% have self-harm thoughts and 20% have suicidal thoughts. And these aren't just people in public service loan forgiveness, by the way. These are we opened up the sample for anybody in income-driven repayment plan and public service loan forgiveness. The idea that 20% of a sample is thinking about suicide already is alarming. However, as you see from the other graphic, a lot of people are making up plans, and a fair degree are making attempts or have made attempts. So we need to really pay attention to what's going on here as time progresses and more uncertainty in the student loan system exists. Now, one thing that we wanted to know was by repayments. So again, we opened it up to other people. What does this look like? And I call this the value of forgiveness, because we have people that are in repayment in any income-driven repayment plan. About 28% think about non-suicidal self-harm, and 23% think about suicide. We have people in the save forbearance, so they're just waiting. They're just trying to figure out what this all looks like. Again, these are even. These are still not the same people reporting the same degree of it, but they are even across these two graphics. We have people waiting on a forgiveness decision, and again, these people consistently flag as having an extreme amount of psychological distress. And these are the individuals we need to start focusing on very heavily to make sure that they know that there are opportunities out there for them to get help and checking in on our people. So what else do we see here? We see the self-harm thoughts from part 1 and part 2. Things are getting worse over time. Part 1 is from data collected from January 1st to March 23rd. I had to shut down the survey because I got a DDoS attack, so I had to restart the survey the day after. And that was fortunate because then there was just this marker that exists that, okay, well, earlier in the year this was this, later in the year this was this. And we're seeing self-harm thoughts increase. We're seeing suicidal thoughts increase. We're seeing serious mental distress increase. We're seeing low food security slightly increase as well. And so we are going to set different markers to see what happens at different policy points in time and we're going to keep collecting data for the year. Now, we also see a lot of issues surrounding food security as of late. And again, I want to point out this is the outcome of forgiveness via public service loan forgiveness, and hopefully one day for a lot of people, income-driven repayment forgiveness. The value of forgiveness is more than monetarily; it's psychological by a lot. Now, those individuals who are waiting on a forgiveness decision, um, again, they are much different on average than other people. So we need and I can tell you from previous responses, we interviewed 124 people and we interviewed everybody that we could who was waiting on a forgiveness decision. It comes down to hedging their bets. They don't know if they're going to get this. They don't believe the government will honor it once they get it. So they're making plans to, in the meantime, to get that negative outcome that exists, which creates a lot of distress. And it creates a lot of financial distress and changes their behaviors to ensure that they have the maximum amount of resources on hand in case that doesn't go their way. And then we'll wrap up here real quickly. Very few people have trust in their servicers. This is agree or completely agree or fully agree. Sorry, agree or strongly agree. There's no clarity from servicers. There's no trust in the federal government guidance. There's no clarity from the government guidance on student loans and how to repay and everything. And there's a lot of uncertainty and confusion. The good thing is, a lot of these people, despite having a lot of negative relationships with the ability to pay their student loans, believe college was worth it. And college is a good thing. And college is an important thing for their children, but it may not necessarily manifest in ways that a lot of individuals like to promote it. These are people on average with a master's degree, and they're paid generally well. But when you control for cost of living, maybe they're slightly below median. But overall, they're paid well, and a lot of people are down with their kids getting the trades, and a lot of media influencers would suggest that anybody with a college degree looks down upon people with a trades degree, and that's not necessarily true. And then when you get things closer to people like reported minimum level of educated needed for other financial members or other members' financial security, you see that these are important factors in individuals' life, and they want at least some kind of minimum level related to a trades degree. An associate's degree are way off to the side over there. And that's a great thing because there's not that negative atmosphere that exists in the ways that other people would want to believe. Now, I have a lot of stuff. I can talk all day, but it's very limited here. I have papers, and you can go to the QR website here to read some of those papers. I can also, let's see here, real quickly show you I can't stop share. There we go. Share with you this. One thing about qualitative data is there's always a lot of it, and you can't always report a lot of it in papers. So I created a website that takes people's responses and puts it through natural language processing stuff, because I can't use the real voices. I did not ask for permission the first time around, but you can hear about their experiences with learning about public service loan forgiveness, mental distress of student loan debt, what the balances mean, forgiveness, and other things that might be of interest to you. I update those consistently, but it's just me updating it, and so it's taking a while to put everybody in. So yeah, I think that's where I'll end here, and I'll let Dominique have the floor.
Thanks for the pass off, Dan. Also, some people might want you to put the link to that in the chat. Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I am just hitting the timer, so I make sure that as much as humanly possible, I stick to the time that we were asked to. And boom. Okay. So I am going to talk to you sort of about, in general, the barriers to accessing state financial aid. So you've gotten a chance to hear from two people about student loans broadly, and I've been asked to use state financial aid as an example of thinking through sort of how do people even get access to financial aid? Sort of the first step before we start thinking about how much debt people have accumulated. And so the way you can think about it, right? This webinar title is Student Loan Crisis, Policy Burden, and Borrowers' Well-Being. So I'm the one that's talking to you about burdens. And this in particular is drawing from a paper that I did with some colleagues and is led by a fabulous graduate student from Penn State, Annie Everett. But let's start off with the fact that, okay, state financial aid. In general, obtaining and using financial aid is a really complex process. It seems like I don't necessarily have to tell the audience that you all are about that, but I will note that we typically focus on the federal financial aid, but it's really just as complex when we're thinking about state aid, how people can gain access to state financial aid for colleges and universities. And that is particularly it matters, I'll say, because we can think about all these ways that state aid plays a role. It was $14.9 billion in fiscal year 2024. So that's academic year 23-24. And about 80% of that went to public institutions. So we're not talking about a small amount of money, even though it is true that the federal government provides more funding. We're still not talking about a small amount of money. And there are a lot of students who rely heavily on state financial aid in order to be able to afford to go to college. And it's really important to always keep in mind there's no one size that fits all. The shorthand that I have for this, I belong to a collective of researchers who do a lot of work thinking about individual states. And the rule that we always have is if you know one state, you know one state. So each individual state has lots of different rules and eligibility requirements, and they have a different set of institutions. And so all of that really matters heavily when it comes to trying to figure out how financial aid works. So just to show you as an example, this is a figure that's using SHIO data. And basically, the only thing I want you to take away from it, these bars, these blue bars, are public higher education state financial aid per full-time equivalent student as a percentage of education appropriations from the state. So it's basically the share of state appropriations that is dedicated to financial aid, and it's just per full-time equivalent student. And the main thing I want you to take away, this is looking from 2001 to 2024, is that over time, this number is increasing. So what we see is a steady increase across the country in the share of state appropriations that's going toward financial aid for public institutions. But when we break this out by states themselves, you can see that there's wide variation. You don't have to spend time like looking at every single one. The only thing to take away, right, is that like those bars are very different. And I just highlight for you that we go from Montana that has 0.6% of its appropriations that go to state financial aid, and we go to South Carolina that has 27%. So when I say wide variation, I mean there is wide variation in how much funding these states are providing for state financial aid. And I'll just highlight, since we will be talking about Tennessee today, that Tennessee is towards that upper end of how both the share of appropriations that they dedicate to state financial aid, but also the raw amount that they dedicate. I didn't show that because of our time constraints, but I've got tons of figures if people want to know more about them. Okay, so that's sort of why state financial aid matters and the fact that different states really have different environments. But I'm here also to talk about administrative burden. And so this is generally thought of as the frictions that individuals experience in accessing public programs. I saw as people were saying where they work, I am certain I don't have to tell y'all that when it comes to public benefits, there can be a lot of hoops that people have to jump through to prove that they are eligible, to prove that they sort of deserve access to the funds. And so Scholars have sort of conceptualized this into three buckets. That's learning costs, compliance costs, and psychological costs when it comes to getting access to these funds. So learning costs are things like the steps someone has to take to even learn about the program, that it exists, that the person might actually be eligible for the program. There's sometimes where people know that a program exists, but they have no idea that like it could actually apply to them. Compliance costs. So those are things like whatever the eligibility requirements are. What do you have to do to make sure that you are eligible, that you prove that? And then psychological costs, which we can often think of as sort of the stigma that might be attached to different programs. We often think of this when it comes to things like, for example, people who receive benefits that are tied to the fact that they have fewer economic resources, right? That they are lower income, and that there can be stigmas that our society attaches to people with a lower income. So all of those things can create barriers and challenges to people gaining access to the programs that they are eligible for, and they are the actual targets that are supposed to receive the funds. And it's important to note that these burdens are typically have a stronger effect on people who have less time, less money, and less power. For all the reasons, right? They have, if you have to work two jobs in order to put food on the table, you have less time to complete additional paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. That's true for any type of public monies, which means that it is true for state financial aid. So what we did in our project is we focused on Tennessee for a number of reasons, but in particular, Tennessee is often seen as a state that's really innovative when it comes to higher education policy. And we decided to examine state legislation and aid documents for 23 different Tennessee aid programs. And we looked over, our data is over a decade. So it's fiscal year 2011 to fiscal year 2024. And basically, we examined 27 different features of those programs in order to try to get a better sense, a better understanding of how much burden do people have to face in order to gain access to this money. Said another way, how many hoops do students and their families have to jump through in order to get access to financial aid money that they are eligible for? And so the things we looked at program requirements. So these are things like, do you have to complete the free application for federal student aid? Is there a restriction on you can't be currently or formerly incarcerated? Their application logistics. So these are things like, do you have to write essays? Do you have to get recommendations? Is the funding itself first come, first serve? Documentation requirements. So are there promissory notes that students and their families have to complete? And enrollment logistics. So these are things like, do you have to be a full-time enrolled student in order to gain access to these funds? Is there a field study restriction? Do you have to be studying, for example, a STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math? Like, do you have to be studying one of those fields in order to be able to gain access to these programs? All of these are just some examples of the 27 different facets we looked at to better understand what are the barriers that students have to surmount in order to be able to gain access to state financial aid. And so this is an example of the variation across programs on something we call the burden index, which is what we put together to measure across these burdens. And the only thing you have to take away from this is that the bars are different. So the key thing here is that there is variation across these different programs in how much burden there is for students and their families to access financial aid. So even within a single state, there can be wide variation in how many hoops students and their families have to jump through. And I thought it would also be interesting. And so I pulled out this. What you're seeing, don't worry, I will make sure that this all makes sense. What you are seeing is we took each one of the programs and we said, using our burden index variable that we created, let's look over time and let's see from 2011 to 2024, how much burden was there. So each one of these little figures is a different program looking over time. The only thing I want you to see is I put a box around every one of these where the burden is the same the entire time that the program is in effect. And so that's 14 programs. Each one of them has a red box around it. So the main thing to take away from this is for a large number of programs, the burden stays the same. That whatever the requirements are, whatever the number of restrictions that happen, that those generally do not change. They are very consistent over a decade plus of time, and that matters as we think about our recommendations here in a moment. But so we did additional analysis with regressions and like all sorts of things. But our key findings was that in general, in Tennessee for this time period, financial aid that targeted racially minoritized students had the highest amount of burden. And this is literally programs that say this is targeted towards minority students. Um, and then that financial aid targeting technical and community colleges had, on average, the lowest amount of burden. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that these things are like on average because, in particular, one of the highest burden state financial aid programs is actually the Tennessee Promise, which is a program that is directly tied to community college enrollment. So it is not the case that just because on average community colleges had the lowest burden, that all of the programs targeted towards community college had the lowest burden. And then, since we were told that in particular, a lot of the audience would be people who actually are, right, like in the trenches working with students and their families, I wanted to highlight sort of three big takeaways from like a practice perspective. And the first is that it's not enough to have a state financial aid program. It's just as important to understand the hoops that students must jump through in order to gain access. And given that the requirements for access to state financial aid rarely become easier, anytime, so A, you saw that generally speaking, the requirements to get access to financial aid, they stay consistent over time. And the times that we saw changes, the overwhelming majority of those changes were to increase the level of burden. It was not to decrease. Given that the requirements rarely become easier, it's important to think carefully about eligibility policies at their inception. So, this is particularly true when what we call sort of frontline or street level bureaucrats. So that's the folks who actually implement policies, not the people who argue about coming up with them. That any discretion that people who are actually implementing the policies have, that it's really important to think about what those burdens look like. And then finally, that it's critical to understand how students and their families apply for and maintain access to state financial aid. It is not always a simple process. As you saw, right, we had wide variation for different programs. And so it's not something as simple as students provide the free application for federal student aid, and then they're automatically guaranteed that they get state funding. So those are three recommendations to think about generally, and I am looking forward to the Q&A. Thank y'all for having me.
Very good. Thank you so much, everyone, for those excellent presentations. We have received quite a few questions, so I'll just jump right in. I'm going to direct this first question to Daniel, and then open it up for others as well. It's clear from the research presented today that student debt can have strong implications on emotional well-being and mental health. You all mentioned it in some way or another in your presentations. Do you have examples of resources being provided to assist with these impacts? Given that many people struggling with these issues are in the workforce and don't have access to, say, campus resources or their university resources anymore, have you heard of programs that are being provided by employers to help with these stressors and this mental health impact around student debt?
So the answer is that's complex because there's lots and lots of people, right? But one of the things that when you first ask this question, I hear these words. One of the things that I think about are the people that I've talked to who do not feel like they can even confide in their own family because every time they bring up the idea of student loan repayment or student loan forgiveness or programs related to student loan forgiveness, since it has been so politicized that they family members automatically shut that down without an understanding of how that is affecting these individuals. So there is a lack of community, and I do have a paper about online communities specifically for public service loan forgiveness, where people have told me that they find their communities there with other people that know what that feels like versus their own family members who might empathize to a degree with these individuals, but not understand why that impacts them to the degree for which they are. I'm designing some research now. Hopefully, it will be funded to identify the individuals who are of most financial and psychological distress in my sample to see if we can help them with online um, resources that would ease some of this. But I'm just going to tell you right now, things are getting worse for these people, or at least the data I'm collecting shows that it's getting worse. There's a lot of uncertainty, especially with new programs. Additionally, there's a lot of economic uncertainty as we see a lot of layoffs as of recent, and maybe it hasn't hit all these people yet, but you see layoffs in the federal level. State budgets are not doing so great. You're going to see layoffs at those levels. You're going to see local layoffs most likely. I mean, obviously, I can't predict the future. I'd be the richest man in the world if I could, but there's going to be a lot of pain moving forward. So it's going to be hard to figure out what this looks like even in 6 months from now. So the answer is I don't know what people are getting. Some people have said that they are also in therapy, but that's for total financial distress, not just their student loan.
Anyone else can jump in now if you have anything to say on that topic.
I guess I'll just add, I don't have any specific knowledge of employers that are dealing with this for their employees. But one of the things I think a lot, especially within the past 2 to 3 years, as we've seen this policy topic, stay front page news, and there's been a lot of volatility about whether or not we're going to get debt cancellation, whether or not we're stopping, whether it's in litigation. This can also play into the mental health of people that are waiting or trying to find out like whether or not they're going to be recipients of debt cancellation, if they're going to be able to repay back, or if they're going to have to go back to their old, or if their interests are going to be counted or not. So I think that this policy play that's been going on is definitely correlated with some of probably the findings that Dan is finding in his work with respect to how the policy landscape is affecting, I mean, their own debt burdens affecting their mental health, but also the policy landscape around this issue has been affecting people's own health outcomes.
Okay. This is a question that is in that same vein, actually, but a bit different. So I'm going to direct this to you, Fenaba. Have you seen any of these negative impacts that you are finding on borrowers around both the financial well-being and the mental health spilling over onto their family members, whether that be spouses, partners, parents, children, etc.? Is there any research on how this is changing family decisions and milestones, or longer-term outcomes of this debt burden across generations, especially when we're thinking about Black families?
Thank you for that question. So interestingly, I also have a paper that looks at generational differences in how student debt is associated with relationship formation and movements into marriage. And we do see there's a generational shift with respect to it being a factor for more recent generations of young adults as opposed to older generations. This is logic. They have larger debt burdens, but also, as we suspect, we weren't able to get at it exactly, but who is more likely to have this student loan debt? I think when we think about the role that student loan debt has in Black families, it's really like we talk about in our book, it's like all hands on deck. We have everyone trying to assist this child to go to college. So it is very much a familial kin network based activity of pursuing college education. There's some great work around and research done around the education gospel around how do we kind of support and the way that higher education is just kind of revered within our community, and what that might mean, as I kind of referenced in some of my presentation earlier, is that we see people making sacrifices, taking risk, financial risk, with respect to helping their child pursue their college dreams, and that having large detrimental effects to their own financial well-being, as well. I'm not aware, I should say, to kind of caveat, I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at the health effects on the kind of kin networks, but one could imagine that there is probably some strong strong relationships going on there as well. Especially if you have to co-sign for like private loans, there's just so many different ways in which we see these um, this pursuit of higher education kind of infiltrating the financial like balance sheet of families. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just gonna pop in to say that AARP has done some really interesting stuff where they look at, because it's always important to keep in mind, as someone has mentioned in the chat, right, that we are at a point where it's not just about people's individual student loans for themselves. It's also student loans that they take on for children, like through both their own student loans and Parent Plus. But one of the things that's been really nice about AARP's work is they've also looked at going beyond just federal student loans and looking at how do families and kin networks provide financial support generally, taking on additional jobs, going into savings, taking money out of retirement accounts, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what are the different ways that kin are able to support? And it lines up with everything that Philippa's been saying. So I just wanted to mention that, like, this also expands beyond just the student loans that people borrow.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more question, and I think we'd be hard pressed to get through a discussion in this day and age without talking about AI in one way or another. So I'm very sorry if you all aren't up on that topic, but it does feel like this will impact decisions around attending higher education and taking out loans, and potentially the ability to apply for loans and financial aid in terms of administrative burden. So how do you think AI might impact the higher education space in terms of decision-making around career preparation or degree path? How does it seem like this could change the calculus for students thinking about investing in higher education and incurring student debt for future careers, given the current unknowns around job security and job path? This person was especially interested in those who seek associate degrees or attend community colleges. Dominique, I'm going to let you take this question first, and then you can pass it along to your colleagues.
Sure, yeah. So I will say, I think it's really important to keep in mind, I think I have a lot of thoughts about what we're talking about generally is agentic AI. So that is agent chatbots in general that do large language models, I'm assuming, because the other pieces of this, things like machine learning and other elements that sometimes get grouped into AI, have been around for decades. And so those have been a part of higher education for a significant period of time. So with that, one of the key things I think it's always useful to do is sort of look back and see historically what have we seen when these types of quote unquote innovations hit. And one of the useful ones to think about is coding boot camps. So for a significant period of time, we created boot camps where people could learn to code. And these were supposed to catapult people into the middle class or higher. I think two critical things about that are incredibly important. Number one, those coding boot camps did everything they could to try to get access to student loans. They were not programs that were free. And so I don't see why anything around for a lot of people that are interested in making money off of teaching about agentic AI and LLMs, they would like to make money. And they would love to have access to student loans. So I don't see why that would reduce that. And then the secondary piece is that from what we've mainly seen, most of those coding boot camps were very poorly run. And we're primarily focused on, see the answer to part one, making money. And so there are a lot of questions at play about when we say AI, what do we mean by AI? And what is the training that people actually need? Because, right, we've just recently gotten a number of articles that show that a lot of people that went to go to these like coding boot camps ultimately did not get jobs that required coding. And we should be skeptical of whether or not people going to train and learn how to use ChatGPT better will automatically be receiving jobs that provide more stability from a financial standpoint, but also more broadly for their families.
That's a great cautionary note to end on. Thanks for that. Thanks for giving us that information, Dominique. And I feel like that was a little bit farther afield, but also really important. I feel like we could probably have an entire webinar on that topic alone. But we do have to end today. But thank you so much, Fenaba, Daniel, and Dominique. You were all excellent panelists today, and I think shared a wealth of information. Thanks to Dawn Duran, who is handling our technology today for this webinar. And just a reminder that we will be posting the recording of this webinar within a day or so, and I will be sending out the recording to all who registered. And with that, thanks for joining us and have an excellent rest of your day.